A peace deal can be announced, a blockade can stay in place, and strikes can keep falling all at the same time. So when the headlines say diplomacy is moving forward, the real question is simple: forward for who? Today's story is a mess in the way major geopolitical stories usually are. Iran says it has put forward a framework to end the war. Trump says a deal is largely negotiated, then says not to rush it. In Gaza, the ceasefire story has turned into a fight over whether Palestinians are being asked to surrender after agreeing to pause the fighting. And in Lebanon, a ceasefire keeps producing funerals for medics, rescue workers, and families. We'll break down what the articles actually say, compare where they agree and where they clash, and look at the part that keeps getting buried. These are not just negotiations, they're pressure campaigns dressed up as peace. The Iran reporting is the best place to start, because it shows how fast the language of peace can become a cover for coercion. One report says Iranian officials have floated a framework to end the U.S. war, reopen the Strait of Hormuz temporarily, but only if Washington ends its blockade of Iranian ports, releases frozen Iranian assets, and compensates Iran for war damage. Another report says Trump told negotiators not to rush because, in his words, time is on our side. And a third says he's still weighing fresh strikes if he doesn't get the answer he wants. That combination tells you a lot. The public version is talks are progressing. The operational version is the military threat stays on the table while the talks happen. That's not uncommon in diplomacy, but in this case the threat doesn't seem to be a backup plan. It seems to be part of the negotiating method. What stands out in the Iranian proposal is sequencing. Tehran wants the war to end first, then the nuclear issue to be handled in a second phase. Washington appears to want the nuclear issue and the war to be resolved at the same time. That sounds like a technical disagreement, but it really isn't. If one side is still being blockaded and threatened with strikes, it is not negotiating from a normal position. It is negotiating under fire. The articles also show a major contradiction in the official narrative. U.S. officials keep saying Iran cannot be allowed to keep enriched uranium or retain the ability to make a weapon, but multiple intelligence assessments have not concluded that Iran was actively building one, so the public is being asked to accept an emergency premised on a claim that the government itself has not clearly proven. That matters because once the threat is treated as self-evident, almost any demand starts sounding reasonable. Iran, meanwhile, is signaling that it wants sanctions relief, access to its own money, and some recognition of its right to enrich uranium at limited levels for civilian purposes. That is not a crazy position inside the framework of non-proliferation diplomacy. In fact, a lot of it sounds a lot like the structure of the 2015 nuclear agreement, just with more distrust now because Trump tore up the last version. And that's the part mainstream coverage often soft-pedals. This isn't happening in a vacuum. There is a long memory here. From Tehran's perspective, why would they hand over leverage again if Washington might simply walk away later? From Washington's perspective, why would they trust a deal that leaves Iran with any strategic breathing room? Once you strip away the press release language, the core issue is credibility, not just centrifuges. If this kind of breakdown is helping you separate the reporting from the spin, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. There's also a bigger strategic detail that barely gets enough attention. The Strait of Hormuz isn't just a regional choke point, it's a pressure valve for the global economy. So when Iran says it may reopen transit only under certain conditions, and when U.S. officials keep the blockade in place until an agreement is certified and signed, both sides are basically using world commerce as leverage. That's not peace, that's hostage-style bargaining with oil markets in the middle. And if you're wondering why the rhetoric keeps swinging between we're close and we're ready to go, that's because both sides may believe the same thing. The other side will blink first. The trouble is, when governments start believing that, civilians end up paying the price before anyone admits the gamble failed. The Gaza reporting follows the same pattern, only more brutally. According to resistance leaders and Palestinian negotiators quoted in the articles, the ceasefire framework that was signed last year is being rewritten in practice. The first phase was supposed to stop the shooting, exchange captives, open crossings, and allow early reconstruction. But now Trump's Board of Peace is reportedly pushing a second phase logic. It says essentially, no reconstruction, no withdrawal, no real future unless Hamas and other resistance groups give up their weapons first. That is a huge shift, and the articles are clear that Hamas says it never agreed to that as part of the original deal. This is where the coverage gets slippery. Officially, Washington and Tel Aviv can say they're just insisting on security conditions, but in practical terms, the demand works like this: disarm first, then maybe get rights, aid, rebuilding, and partial withdrawal later. That is not a negotiation between equals. It is a demand for surrender with a timetable attached. And that's why the Palestinian sources in the reports keep rejecting the framing. They're saying the issue of weapons is tied to political rights, occupation and statehood, not just security theater. Whether one agrees with Hamas politically or not, it's hard to ignore the basic point. If a territory remains occupied, heavily controlled, and repeatedly attacked, demanding unilateral disarmament before meaningful political concessions is not exactly a recipe for stability. Mainstream coverage often treats disarm Hamas as if it's the obvious answer and then moves on, but the missing question is what happens if the armed group disappears and the underlying political problem doesn't? Does the occupation end? Does reconstruction begin? Do civilians suddenly become safe? The articles suggest the opposite. The violence could just shift form while the political impasse remains. There's another layer here that deserves more attention. The sources say Trump's team has pushed a roadmap that frames disarmament as the key that unlocks everything else. That sounds neat on paper. In reality, it gives the occupying side enormous leverage while asking the occupied side to give up its only bargaining chip. Even if you believe disarmament is eventually necessary, sequencing matters. The strongest line in the reporting comes from the Palestinian side. They say Israel and the U.S. are trying to force a framework where the ceasefire becomes conditional on Palestinian capitulation, while Israeli forces continue to control much of Gaza and violations continue daily. If that's accurate, then the word ceasefire is doing a lot of cosmetic work. It's less a pause in war than a restructuring of terms under ongoing pressure. What's often missing from TV coverage is the moral asymmetry. One side has overwhelming military power, external backing, and control over borders and airspace. The other side is being told to hand over the one thing it can still use to resist. You can call that a peace process if you want, but it starts to sound a lot more like managed defeat. And once that framing settles in, the public gets trained to see every refusal as extremism, while the original demand gets treated as common sense. That's a very old trick, and it works because it sounds reasonable when repeated enough. If the Iran and Gaza stories are about leverage, Lebanon is about what happens when violence becomes routine enough that the world stops reacting to it properly. The reporting here is grim. Israeli strikes have killed paramedics, damaged hospitals, destroyed ambulance stations, and kept hitting southern Lebanon despite the supposed ceasefire. One article describes a killing spree against rescue workers. Another says more than 120 healthcare workers have been killed and more than 260 wounded since March. Hospitals and ambulances have been hit repeatedly. Some attacks even follow the double-tap pattern. Strike once, then hit again when emergency crews arrive. That detail is not small. It tells you the danger is not just collateral damage. When first responders are repeatedly killed, the functioning of civilian life itself is under attack. You don't need to be a legal scholar to understand the effect. People get scared to respond, patients get trapped, and the idea of medical neutrality starts to collapse. Israeli officials have said the strikes are aimed at Hezbollah fighters or Hezbollah-linked infrastructure. The problem is that the reporting keeps showing civilian homes, rescue workers, health centers, and ambulances bearing the brunt of the attacks. If the justification is true, the evidence should be easy to show. Instead, the pattern seems to be accusation first, consequences later, and accountability never. That's why the backlash is slowly growing. Human rights groups are calling out possible war crimes. European officials are expressing alarm. Even governments that usually speak in careful diplomatic code are sounding more direct, because the scale of the damage is getting hard to ignore. Yet the bombardment keeps going, and the word ceasefire keeps showing up in the same paragraph as new evacuation orders and fresh strikes. One of the most disturbing parts of the Lebanese reporting is how ordinary the horror has become for the people living through it. Paramedics are sleeping at hospitals because their homes are unsafe. Rescue crews are waiting for the next call while trying not to get hit by the very system they're trying to save. Families are burying children, medics, and neighbors while the official statements describe everything as targeted, limited, and necessary. That gap between language and reality is huge. It's also where media framing matters most. If a newsroom says Israel says it is targeting Hezbollah infrastructure without following up on what the strikes actually hit, then the audience gets a sanitized version of events. But when you read the local reporting, the picture is much darker. Repeated strikes on civilian life, then a defensive explanation after the fact. And there's an uncomfortable bigger lesson here. Once a military campaign is allowed to keep operating under a ceasefire label, the public gets conditioned to accept contradiction as normal. That's dangerous, because it lowers the threshold for what governments think they can get away with. A ceasefire that doesn't stop the shelling is not peace. Step back, and the pattern gets hard to miss. In one set of articles, the Strait of Hormuz is being used as leverage over oil, food, and sanctions. In another, Gaza reconstruction is being tied to surrender terms. In Lebanon, a nominal ceasefire masks continued bombardment of civilians and medics. Elsewhere in the day's roundup, the UN is warning that a Hormuz blockade could set off a global food shock, and even a chemical tank emergency in Southern California is forcing tens of thousands of people to evacuate over a hazardous leak. That last story matters for a simple reason. It reminds you that public safety failures do not need a battlefield. Sometimes they come from neglected infrastructure, bad planning, and institutions that only react once people are already in danger. The same logic shows up overseas too. Officials keep insisting they have control, while the public deals with the consequences of systems that are anything but under control. The common thread is not ideology, it's power. Who has it, who uses it, and who pays when it gets exercised through force instead of negotiation. First, the Iran talks are real, but so are the threats, and that means the diplomacy is happening under military pressure. Second, the Gaza ceasefire story is being reshaped into a surrender demand, with disarmament treated as the entry fee for everything else. Third, Lebanon shows the most brutal version of the same pattern, a ceasefire in name, continued strikes in reality, and medics paying the price. And finally, the mainstream version of these stories often explains the events without explaining the power structure underneath them. The next few days could decide whether these negotiations turn into an actual pause in violence or just another round of pressure dressed up as progress. I'll be watching the follow-up closely, especially any new moves on Iran, Gaza, and Lebanon. If you want more breakdowns that go past the headlines and into what the reporting is really saying, hit like, subscribe, and leave a comment with the story you think the media is still not treating honestly. And if the Iran negotiations break one way or the other, that's probably the next place this channel will be looking.